to the Everybody Matters podcast. This show is an outreach of Barry-Wehmiller. Don't forget to connect with us on the web at barry-wehmiller.com, on Twitter at Barry-Wehmiller, on Facebook and LinkedIn, and check out our blog, trulyhumanleadership.com. I'm Brent Stewart, your host. Fred Falker has worked as an organizational development consultant for more than 30 years, helping organizations with performance management, customer service, and diversity issues. Educated at Washington University in St. Louis, he is the president of Falker Consulting Group, a human resource development training and consulting firm. He's also the director of workforce development for the St. Louis Zoo, where he has worked extensively on helping the organization's efforts to establish itself as one of the best places to work, serve, and volunteer in the country. Over the past few months, there have been a lot of difficult conversations around race in the U.S. Part of that conversation revolves around the workplace and our responsibilities as leaders to diversity and inclusion. On today's podcast, Matt Whiat, founding partner of Chapman Co Leadership Institute, Barry-Wehmiller's leadership consulting firm, has a conversation with Fred about the work companies need to do to build more inclusive and collaborative cultures. Fred, who is African American, has developed a fundamentally different approach that goes beyond unconscious and implicit bias training. Instead of focusing on the differences between people, Fred focuses on the distance between people and the behaviors that drive connection, regardless of the demographic makeup of a team, department, or organization. And we start off this conversation with Fred talking about some memories he had as a child growing up in Indiana and Missouri. Here's Fred Falker.
Now I can remember incidents of things that I was clueless to growing up. I can remember going skating. My mother loved to skate, and I think we went to a skating ring. And I remember having fun, but I can remember asking and saying, hey, when could we come back? And then they started talking about like Tuesdays. I don't know what the day was. But no one said that was the only day you could go because we were colored. But it was clear in hindsight that was the only day that we could go. I can remember being called. No, I can remember going to the movies with a white kid who was my best friend in probably the first or second grade, and him using the N-word. Now obviously he didn't use it. Well, I'm not sure that he used it maliciously, but I'm not sure I knew what it meant. I just remember my mother saying to him, hey, we don't use words like that.
He was calling you that, or he was
I think it was in a conversation. When he would have said casually, Yeah. And so we would have been with my mother because we were probably 6 or 7 years old at the time.
Yeah.
And she would have said, hey, we don't say those things. And I would have said, I'm not sure what I said. I just like, okay, yeah. My mother's really strong. But then that was my mother. She was correcting anybody that was around, or you couldn't be around.
Yeah.
So,
and when's the first time, since we're on this topic, like the N-word, when's the first time, or has it ever been, where somebody used that term on you, like calling you that?
I also probably in Indiana, and I think it would have been walking from school. And I can remember people driving down the street. And I'm thinking, in my mind, I'm probably 6, 7 years old at the most, in a pickup truck yelling that at me. I'm assuming, because I think I was the only person walking down the street.
Yeah.
And probably saying to myself, what's that about? but it's pretty clear that they were angry. But I mean, they kept going.
And so help me out. So you have this, and kids are always curious. So you ask your mom, you ask your dad about this word or this kind of behavior, and how does a parent kind of help a child through that, or even explain it in that time of year, in that time of our history?
I don't know that ever came up.
Really?
I don't know that I gave it one thought, but I clearly remember it happening. But I don't know that I went home and said, hey, some folks was going down the street and they called this. What is that about? I don't know that happened. So we wouldn't have had any racial conversations in my family, at least while I lived in Indiana. I can remember being stopped by my father being stopped by police, and we needing to go back to some town because he was speeding or whatever. I don't think I knew what was going on then. I think I just thought that was the custom, that you got stopped and rousted like that. So I don't think and my parents would have never said anything about it being like that.
Almost to protect the kids from, like, the whole thing about the skating rink. Like, yeah, we can come back on Tuesday. Not that I don't want to tell my kids this is the only day because of your skin color. Almost like we didn't talk about it.
That's what I would say in hindsight. That was not something that, as a kid growing up in Indiana, and I was there until I was 10, we would have never had a conversation. And I think it would have all been about protection, because I have no doubt there were all kinds of incidents going on all the times that my mother or father would have simply never brought up to us in that kind of way.
So tell me about, so you do, and you've been doing this consulting in the, let's just call it diversity, equity, inclusion. Let's just call it in the inclusivity space. You've been doing this for a good number of years, for 30 years or so, and consulting with organizations. You've obviously seen a lot in this field and stayed close to it. Can you tell me about recently when you saw the video of George Floyd? What goes through your mind?
Part of what went through my mind is I wonder how many times has this happened before. You wonder how frequent is that. Not the idea that I would do this publicly,
right,
and do this on camera and do this with impunity, but just the sheer number of times it's not filmed, how long and how often this has gone on, and how, frankly, many African Americans have responded to it and or not responded to it. So I think we have, speaking as an African American male, many people have learned how to live with that. So
say more about that. What do you mean?
We've been trained. You hear in the news all the times, about the lessons you've got to teach your black sons to your sons about how to deal with police. I don't know anybody black, no friend of mine, who wouldn't agree with that completely, and probably every one of them complies with that.
Give me some tactical examples, like teaching, training your children. Like what are those?
Being very polite, almost solicitous, lots of yes sirs and no sirs. So we don't say yes sir and no sir mostly in this country anymore to anybody. Why would we need to say that to police officers? I mean, they're not older than we are. Saying yes sir and no sir was a sign of respect, I think, in the South, but certainly in the black community. This is how you spoke to adults. Well, a police officer would not be an adult to me, or no more than an adult. having our hands on the steering wheel, making sure you
When
never,
pulled over, making
absolutely,
sure. Yep.
your hands would be in plain visible sight. You would always ask for permission. And I think a lot of people some people might say, well, of course we would do that. But you wouldn't do it thinking you have to do it because you're black. You would do it thinking that, well, I don't want to be an accident. I think as an African American, you would think, as an African American, I could get shot right now.
And you mentioned the permission thing. You mentioned, like, if you're pulled over, that you would ask the police officer, do you mind if I get my license and registration out of my pocket or out of the glove box or something like that? Is that what you meant?
That would be right. You would do that. You would all of these things would be running through your head. We've heard of people who drive to a well-lit area, so they just keep going. They're not really trying to escape. They're just trying to get to a place where there are other people who would witness them being stomped.
Because you don't know what's going to happen. So it's almost a trust element that I want other people to see what's going to go down during this.
I feel safer if there are other people around, but obviously that didn't actually make you safe. If you have a predator, like some of the police officers that we've seen here recently, then you're not safe.
Sure.
There either, and with the current culture, the culture in policing, that we are a family and we don't intervene in then having other police officers there would not save you.
Right. What are other thoughts you have when watching the George Floyd? So you think to yourself, I wonder how long this has gone on, what we have done. Our time's different now. You look at this and you think, this is the watershed moment. This is what we have to do. Like, you're literally into Washington University because of people who made demands and stood for those demands and values. And now fast forward 30 years and this happens and you think, what's your responsibility?
Yeah, I don't think it was in my mind, it was not a watershed moment, because I seem to remember watching Rodney King being beaten literally half to death by multiple officers and thinking, well, that's got to be a watershed moment.
Yeah.
It seems to me I've seen so much of this, and the history is replete with African Americans being harmed and hurt at the hands of police officers, that this one didn't appear to be any different. It was filmed and he actually died, but Eric Garner actually died in New York 4, 5, 6 years ago, whenever that occurred. That was filmed. So what made this one different? Look, I think the confluence of events, perhaps the current occupant of the White House has added to that. It is added to how much animosity, distance, and neglect still exist in the country. So I think when you add all of those things together, you remember Freddie Gray. You start remembering all these things that were isolated incidents. But when you add them together, then I think a lot of people started saying, well, there's too much of this now for me to pretend that this is an isolated event. I think what people in the movement did differently and better this time, and I think that was a catalyst event, was kind of tie a bow around all of this.
Yeah.
So when you tie a bow around it and label it for what it is, then it becomes really hard to argue. And I think most people don't want it to be what they've seen. And so the protests will bring about changes in policy. They will bring about some new laws. It will bring about a new consciousness, but will it actually produce real and lasting change? that part I'm not so certain, because you kind of question how deep does the agitation, how deep does it go, and how long does it last? If there
And
are
you've
enough,
seen this play pattern before.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
This play pattern plays out, it seems to me, every time. This one is different, but they're all different, and every one adds on is additive. So when you say that hey, there's no progress, well, that's simply just not true. That's not even, to me, not even remotely true. That's telling yourself a story and convincing yourself that your story is the truth. And there's nothing remotely true about how police operate now than how they operated 20, 30, 40 years ago. But same, violence is violence, and to say that there's less of it doesn't mean that that's a good thing. But there's less of it.
Your mom wears, I love this story, your mom wears an afro as a statement, a Black Studies major, and you look at all this and you say, what? Like, what's the advice to someone, a younger generation? And whether that person is African American, whether they're Caucasian, male, female, like what's your message? Go out and protest. Be strong about this. What's the responsibility every generation has right now toward this?
Well, I think the protesters are owed a great debt by people like me and all of society. We all owe them a great debt for getting out and doing something. That's how I think about the people, the graduate students that got me into Washington University. So yeah. I benefited from somebody else's willingness to speak up, agitate, and do whatever, but it is insufficient. And the insufficiency is not the fault of the protesters. The insufficiency comes from the fact that other people don't do something. But what others need to do is not more protests, it's more work. And so I think that's the thing that you want to put on people. And an example is, okay, so when the law changes or the policy changes, so what follows? What follows that? What are the actions that people on the other side of the policy will take? What are the actions that people will take who are not going to go out and march, but who ought to be doing something? And
they're in a position of influence, if you will.
Yes.
And what could I do? And a lot of this work that you do is directly back into organizations where people spend the vast majority of their waking hours. You do that work. Can you talk just quickly about the things that organizations are doing? I've heard you mention this before, the 4 areas and 3 being really easy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think, organizational leaders and organizations, because of the people in them, want to have a response to social upheaval, the demand on the part of many people that there's some change made. But organizations have always done this. I think they're just doing it a little bit more right now. But after Ferguson, there would have been lots of this. The easy thing, and now fashionable thing. So, I don't want to impugn anybody that's doing it, but I think leaders that are doing it ought to be careful. The easy thing to do is to make a public declaration.
A PR release.
A PR release, a marketing release. The NBA now, I started watching a couple of games, and boy, they're making a public declaration. They've got the players lined up. There are lots of people taking a knee. They've got songs, and they're saying we're not going to stand for it. The NFL is making a similar statement. Okay, they've kept Colin Kaepernick out of the league for all of these years, and now suddenly there is this.
Making apologies to him.
They're making apologies, but he still was out of work for all this time.
Yep.
Still, up until now, they've been more afraid of some fans than appreciative of other fans, but right now it's fashionable to make the statement. So they are. It seems like many of our organizations, the president, CEO, and boards are making statements of what they stand for, what their values are going to be, and how they support not just the protesters, but that Black Lives Matter. Well, all of this stuff is good stuff, but this stuff.
I think you're calling us to. You're calling us to? Your concern is it being done because it's fashionable? It's the right PR thing to do. There's a business angle to it, and I think what you're mentioning is now what's the work that comes after that?
Yes, this is stuff of a social movement. I want to be the last person in the stream. Everybody's in this stream right now, and once the other CEOs start jumping in, and our board wants to know, what are you going to do about it? And we said, well, we're going to make a statement too. And so, with the help of PR and marketing, we craft a great statement. Frequently, sure. I think, listening to some of the CEOs, it is heartfelt, but it's not heartfelt enough for them to have done it prior to now. I mean, it doesn't seem like they've just made it up, but how committed are they to actually doing the work, and how much do they understand what the work actually is? To me, that piece is easy. The second easy piece is the idea that we're going to take a look at our own house right now in terms of structural inequities and structural problems and systemic racism. We're gonna look around because we know we've got some issues.
Such as recruiting, using a recruiter and not having a diverse pool of candidates, having a line like the SAT portion that we just mentioned. Is this really based on merit? And is that the one score I'm using versus potential? Those kind of things.
Those kinds of things. We're going to take a look at all of them. We're going to recommit to something that we no doubt committed to a long time ago. Because that's the other sad thing about it. We've already committed to being a more diverse organization.
Yeah.
And we committed to that 10 years ago. We've committed to 2 or 3 times since then. But we're still not more diverse because that commitment was about as helpful as the piece of paper that is written on, because we weren't actually serious enough about it. So there's that old saying about, if this were really a goal, what would you do? And so you got to ask people who make that commitment, if this is really a goal to have more people of color in these positions, what would you do? Mostly what we do is write a new statement, have a new commitment, hire a new consulting firm, or place somebody around the table. And so we will we'll put somebody at the executive table. We'll give them other things to do, but we'll give them the title of being chief diversity officer or something like that. That will be one of those things that we do. And so we'll do a series of those things, and those things will not be unhelpful, but they also won't change anything. Of course, sometimes they will be unhelpful, because the truth is we'll simply hire the wrong people with the wrong ideas to actually have any real benefit on how the organization functions. Organizations are, in my mind, living communities, and they're not things that can be broken apart, manufactured, reconfigured and make them different. They're people and their relationships. And so if we damage those relationships, when I say damage, I mean make them worse than they already are, then we haven't actually accomplished anything.
Yeah. That
whole part, though, which requires us to spend some money, and in some cases it's to get training. And we're not really serious about this training.
But to your point, it's still easy. It's a stroke of a pen. It's a line item in the budget. I can make a declaration. I can make some hires. Okay. The number 3 area?
Number 3 areas, okay, so this plays into our social responsibility. Lots of organizations already want to demonstrate to their employees and to the community that, hey, we are a good neighbor. We are interested in the community. We are active in the community. We are helping in those areas where the community needs help. We are great neighbors, and you love having us here. That same social responsibility piece makes or can make employees proud to work there. If you've got enough employees to say, hey, this is really important for us, social injustice is important, getting rid of wealth disparities and healthcare disparities and educational disparities in whatever area you want to work in, then doing something in the community and demonstrating that not only works in the community, but when it's done well, it's also something that lots of employees say, I work for XYZ company and we are active in the following areas. And I love it. I'm glad we are committed to doing good as well as making a profit. But again, that's just easy. This is something that we can do. We can do it well if we investigate, figure out where the needs are, and then use our money wisely. Something that we could do.
Okay.
The fourth area, and this is the hard area, and really you just don't see many organizations doing it, at least not under the banner of D&I, which is to literally work to change the culture. So
inside the organization.
Inside the organization, and to start changing the people in the organization. If culture is the sum total of all of our behaviors, then what we're really trying to change is the behavior of the people in the organization. We can't demand that they change. That's not the change we want. That can come from policy. That can come from having values. That can come from saying we are not going to tolerate, we are not going to have the following things happen. And of course, we've already done that in the easy step. What we have not done is started creating a culture of belonging or a culture of caring, that there are organizations that are already involved in this. For me, they have a much easier time making the promises of D&I come true because they already have that as a grounding. Most of what passes as D&I does not touch at all on human beings relating to one another. It is simply not designed to do that. And I think, unfortunately, because some practitioners don't see that as a problem or believe that it is the way it is and it could never change. So in other words, they're always talking about group to group interaction. How does this group get along with that group? Well, the truth is groups don't get along with groups. Groups are concepts that we've created. It is a way of tying a ribbon around it. You know, the black group can't like or dislike the white group. People in those groups like or dislike each other.
The relationships.
It is always about relationship, and any work that never gets to relationship never actually gets to the core reason that we have the issues that we have. Everything that we've talked about dealing with, every single thing comes from relationships. There is no structure out there except the structure that has been created by the behavior of people. People behave in ways intentionally and unintentionally that create the problems that we are now being asked to deal with. So yes, we can deal with those problems with the stroke of the pen. We can change policy. We can say we're going to look at more than the SAT. We're going to look at other things. We can do all of that. But you can't change the conditions that create the eventual new structures. You know, the truth is, if we're not connected to one another, if we're distant from one another, we will continue to create symptoms that will appear a little bit later. Because we'll never get to the place where things really need to change.
If I'm pushing on this, just to ask the question, let's say I'm a CEO, and I say, yep, that sounds all good. We made the declaration. You're probably right. We should have said it before. We have had a diversity goal. I do want to be more inclusive, and I don't know what to do. I can run you the statistics. I can tell you what percentage of this color kind of person or this demographic of this person, I can't find them in this particular skill set because I don't even know where to go. Like what's the counsel or what's the direction you give a CEO who says, I really want to do that. I want to increase the diversity. Tell me what to do. I do want to be anti-racist. I want all of the rhetoric that's right now, and I shouldn't call it rhetoric, all of the the language that's there, and the CEO goes, I just want to get this right. And you say to that person, what?
I say doing many of those things is right and appropriate. They are completely insufficient. So doing those things will be important for the long range overall goal of creating a place where people feel that they belong. You will have to relieve the fever. You will have to relieve the suffering. You will have to relieve the harm that has been done intentionally or unintentionally. You have to do those things, and then you have to do more. And the more part is really calls for a different way of thinking about the issues. The more part is really dealing with how do we help human beings communicate far more effectively with one another so that we begin to treat each other as human beings. And so that is not a soft thing, that is a hard thing. Senior leaders have to figure out how to model that kind of behavior. And of course, some senior leaders got there because they're brilliant in lots of areas, but being brilliant as a human being is not one of the qualities. So how do they start possessing and increasing their ability to do that? Well, one declaration that they get to make, and they certainly would do this with executive coaching, is say, hey, here's the kind of leader that I've been. I've been relatively successful being this, but I now recognize this is 2020. It's not sufficient. I'm gonna model and I'm gonna walk this talk. I am going to work harder for the people in this organization to know me, to know my heart. I'm gonna work harder to be open to other human beings, and I'm going to expect my direct reports, the executive leadership team and the folks in that area, I'm going to expect them to do that. We are going to start hiring people in these jobs who come here not just with the ability to help us really reward our shareholders, but how do we reward our employees? And people who come, and if we make the mistake, we're going to expect them to get better. We do know that there's a difference between leaders, and not everybody will be good at it, but no one is going to be allowed to not work at this. We're going to demonstrate this behavior. Yeah. We're going to look at very different kind of training inside the organization.
And I get what you're saying is a little bit more vulnerability, which is something that relationships can be strengthened by and built on. For some, this can be a little daunting because, to your point, easier to write a check. And I'm not saying it's easy, it's just easier. The funding is available to write a check to a charity. It's easier to make a declaration of a statement. It's easier to tell someone, review our recruiting policies. It's a little more difficult to say, here's where I could have been better and here's where I'm going to be better.
I would say that would be absolutely one of the first things to start with. I think you would want leaders to also understand that latter part is the gift that keeps giving. That first part is the gift that is forgotten once it is used. So once we build a new community center, the next disturbance, you can't say I built you a community center.
Yeah.
You don't get to say what you've done for us. That no longer works if you are the kind of human being that we look up to, and we can say, hey, Matt, hey, Fred, we're disappointed in you. And you can say, I see it. I understand why you're disappointed. It certainly was not my intention, but I get it. Yeah. And we accept that from you. That's the gift that continues to give. But that's you being different. And to the extent that you have an organization that literally values people, literally values not people outside a relationship, but values people in relationship, literally sees itself as an important part of the community, then you can start making those changes. And I think that's the hard work. And I think, like you said, it's the most difficult, because now I'm making myself vulnerable to something that is infinitely harder to do, that I have far less control over. Now I'm really talking about influence, and not, I can signing the check, giving marching orders to my lieutenants, that we will hire a chief diversity officer. We will put money in the budget for diversity training. Those things are easy. Writing a check to build a community center, easy. Bringing in interns to help them with STEM programs, or funding a local high school.
Yeah.
Easy. You know, this work that we're talking about, which is transforming of people's lives by helping them find better ways, is something that's going to take time and require a lot more from organizations. But Matt, the organizations that want to do it, you know, again, asking that question, if this were really important, if this were really the goal,
yep, you do it.
You would do it. And
tell me, Fred,
yeah.
Fred, how does I mean, you have such a gentle way about saying these things. So how does the 5 or 6 year old little boy walking through Anderson, Indiana, being called the N-word by people in the back of a pickup truck, end up all these years later with all of this education, the strength of your mom, end up so open to this and so almost willing to lean into it? Like, where does the optimism about the human condition reside with you after seeing Rodney King, after seeing this happen again and again, and not being necessarily the watershed moment, like you've seen it before, and yet it seems like you still have such a gentle, caring way about this. Like, how does that happen?
Well, I don't know exactly how it happens, but I do. And to me, it's no longer hard work. That I see both things. So my story is less closed down than others. So my story includes the stories of other people, and I literally see, you know, when people are telling stories, I see them differently. If you tell me your story is that, you know, Black people are taking over the world, you know, Black people get this and Black people get that and blah, blah, blah. In that I hear resentment, pain, anger,
Fear.
And those things matter to me because you are a human being. I may agree with none of those things, but I right away get your right. I have in my mind how that comes to be. If I'm having that conversation with somebody, I'm working hard to see them as a human being, and I'm wanting them to see me first and foremost as a human being. If we see each other as anything other than that, we're likely to see each other as either allies or adversaries, and both is not, you know, both kind of confirms our story and denies the humanity of the other person. You know, one of the worst things about the D&I movement, as far as I'm concerned, is that what we demand for ourselves, we don't afford to others.
Say more.
It literally is, you need to experience and understand my pain as an African American or as an individual, but I have no requirement whatsoever to acknowledge any of yours. There's no part of me that needs to do that, and I've conveniently explained it away by creating new stories that do not allow for you to do that.
And if the story exchange doesn't happen, the premise you're giving me is that if I don't exchange those stories, then I don't have the relationship, and I'm not seeing each other as individuals, as people, as humans. Am I getting that right?
I think that would be exactly right. The truth is, our reality is based on how the world occurs to us. And the world occurs to us as our story tells us that it is. No one's story is the truth. Everybody just has a story. And every time you tell somebody that their story is not valid, you are depersonalizing them, angering them, upsetting them, and there is no way you come together for any solution after
Yeah.
that. When I say to political, Trump supporter, then you are a racist or anything like that, and then say the fact that you don't know you're racist is really troubling. Well, the truth is that their story says that they're not. Then my saying that you are is simply a conflict. My insistence that your story is wrong is more conflict, and it is all being done not to a human being but to an object.
Yeah, which is the crux of the stereotype, right? That I am going to brand a group, if you will, and it may or may not be some of it true, some of it not, but I'm never going to know you as a person. I'm just going to label some things around you, but I won't know you, and therefore I probably won't have a relationship either.
Yeah, I just can't get there until I can hear your story and what's in it. And it's hearing what's in your story is the more important thing. The content of your story is not the most important thing. It's the meaning behind the story. And so I think we get it wrong when we say separate facts from emotion.
Yep.
We say that. Well, you can do that, but the emotion is the important part.
Yeah.
Not the facts.
That's what brings people together, right? Over that emotion. Yeah.
The emotion is the important part. The emotion is the meaning. The emotion is the reality. It is what they are currently living. And when we try to argue facts, which is what we do in our world, we argue facts, then you're basically saying that your story is not important. You and your people are all wrong. Mm-hmm. And it is just no way to ever win an argument. And of course, that's part of the problem, is that we're trying to win an argument. They, of course, are trying to win an argument. That conflict can result in them only, winners and losers. Somebody giving up their story, which is the current D&I model, is that we have to win people over. The struggle will continue until the last person is converted. And yet most people don't want to be converted. In fact, they actively resist being converted. So if what we are wanting as human beings is important to both of us, then converting each other ought to be the last thing we ever think about. It's what are our collective human being to human being goals. And I think, pandemic and climate change, feeding the hungry, those ought to be the thing. Those are the kinds of things that literally can't happen with conflict. Not well. We just can't succeed at those things.
Two last questions as we wrap up here. One more factual and perhaps one that's more family or personal related. The first one is this, and I'm asking this because I think just in the circles that you and I have worked in, if I'm not an African American, what's your advice is the wrong word. What's the part where if someone says, okay, I'm not a CEO, I'm not in those positions, I'm not writing checks. I hear everything from what books I should read to I need to not just believe in this, but I should be an anti-racist. Like, what's your perspective? What's your advice of all this time in there? You say to that person who says, I want to do better. I'm an average person that goes through my day. I'm not mean to people. I'm probably not that inclusive. I don't live in a diverse neighborhood. My kids don't go to a diverse school. I don't feel like a bad person, but I don't know exactly what to do as well. I watch it. I don't like what I see on TV. I agree with what you've said today here, Fred, but I don't know what you want me to do.
I think it's be a better human being. When I say be a better human being, be closer be much closer to who you actually are authentically. And so as human beings, we are authentically human. We're born connecting. We know how to connect. It's when we move and change that we become, I won't say less human. We paper over or cover up our humanity. And our humanity is not bound up in reading, and it's not bound up in ideas. It's bound up in how we relate to one another. And so we have to open ourselves up to the humanity of other people and allow them to open themselves to our humanity. In that space, you automatically know what to do. So it's be a better human being. It is to learn literally what that means, and then operate from that perspective. And what it means to me is that there literally is nothing that you have to know in order to be a better human being. You know, I hear stories that most of them I assume is true of extraordinary things that people do all the times. And they do it because they're able to get to that place easier than most of us. You know, I watch, listen, and think about hospice workers. How do you show up every day with people who perhaps were despicable at one time and who've done all kinds of maybe crazy things that you don't like, show up for them in that moment? We're all capable of doing that.
Caring for them as a human. Yeah.
Caring for them as a human. How do you climb a balcony in France and rescue a child dangling, a child that you do absolutely not know? That's just being a human being. The question is, what are all of the things that get in the way that stop us from doing that? And sadly, it's most of the stuff that you get taught. And so most of what happens in the D&I space are things that make connecting with human beings more difficult, not less difficult. The more I think about being an anti-racist or white fragility or any of these things, being an ally, the less likely I am to see you as a human being. And that is sad. And I know that is not the intent, but that is actually what comes from that when it's done incorrectly. So maybe there's a place for it to be done, but it can't start that we are divided by it can't start from the notion that our differences divide us.
And just so I get this right as well, Fred, because I can see when I've heard you speak at some groups, that sometimes people can miss the part about the perspective is still important. It's just that through the story and through me bonding with someone, that I hear their story, that I hear their perspective, that then I'm having the opportunity to share mine as well. I don't know what it's like to walk down the street as a 6-year-old and be called a term that I'm not sure there is an equivalent term that you could call me or a white person that has the same connotation to it. I don't know what that's like, but hearing that from you, I don't hear that from an African-American man. I hear that from Fred and his story, and his mom that wears the afro, and you thinking about the people that went before and made demands of why you were able to get into Washington University, and your thoughts about what you saw with the George Floyd murder. I think has been a powerful time talking with you about this. Our last question is, you have kids. Mm-hmm. You have grandkids.
Yep. Two and one on the way.
2 and 1 on the way of grandkids.
Yep.
What's the hope? What's the hope for your kids? What's the hope for your grandkids?
I think the hope for them, that I have for them, is that they will grow up in a more humane world where they have to hide their identity and who they are less, and that they are ultimately good. Maybe the biggest hope is that they're good people, that they do good, and they do good often, as Congressman Lewis said, and they do it as long as they possibly can. And so if they're doing that, I'll be happy. Now, I probably want them to have money and do other things, but if I have to boil it down, I that's what I would hope for them, and that they have the opportunity to do it, that they live in a world where we're affording people opportunity to get to be able to do these things.
Thanks for listening to the Everybody Matters podcast. If you want to find out more about Chapman Co. and Fred Falker's work on inclusion, please go to ccoleadership.com. For more from Barry-Wehmiller, more about this podcast, and a lot of great content and insight, don't forget to connect with us on the web at barry-wehmiller.com, on Twitter at Barry-Wehmiller, on Facebook and LinkedIn, and check out our blog, trulyhumanleadership.com. Until next time on the Everybody Matters podcast, I'm Brent Stewart. Thanks for listening.